Hello, and welcome to this third in a series of Pilgrim Talks from St. George's College in Jerusalem. In the first two of these Pilgrim Talks, we visited Bethlehem and then Nazareth. We went from Judea in the south to Galilee in the north. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to imagine that we are pilgrims in Jesus' day, perhaps a pilgrim among his company, and we're going to be walking 4 to 5 days to come from Galilee to Jerusalem. Jesus could have taken one of 3 routes to come from north to south. The first would have been to come along the coastal plain. People didn't generally do that. It was marshy and malarial. He could have come down the central spine of hills, but those hills were known for robbers and danger. Probably the most common route for pilgrims coming from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem here in the south was through the Jordan River Valley. The Jordan River Valley is part of the Great Rift Valley that begins in southeastern Africa, makes its way up the eastern side of Africa through the Arabian Peninsula, and finally up through the Jordan River Valley, ending in the Bekaa Valley of southern Lebanon. Now, the Jordan River Valley was not formed by the water erosion of the Jordan River. It's not a grand canyon. In fact, it was formed by tectonic plates, one on the east side of the Jordan River, the other on the west. And that explains why the mountains in the present-day country, the Kingdom of Jordan, are much higher than the mountains, the hills of Samaria to the west. In the center lay the Jordan River, which has 2 halves. The northern half flows out of a spring at the base of Mount Hermon, snakes its way down into the Sea of Galilee, fresh water all the way. The Sea of Galilee, a deep freshwater lake, then empties into the southern half of the Jordan River, which flows down all the way to the northern tip of the Dead Sea, where it enters the Dead Sea. The freshwater entering the saltiest sea on the face of the earth. It's most likely that when Jesus came from the north in Galilee down to Bethany beyond the Jordan, around this area, to be baptized by John, he came down the Jordan River Valley, which did have a main north-south road. He would have had to cut far east to reach the river itself. And as he approaches the familiar words of John, "Why are you coming to me? It is I who should be baptized by you." And this baptismal story is remembered by 1 million Christian pilgrims each year who go down to the Jordan River at a place called Qasr al-Yahud, the castle of the Jews in today's parlance. And they remember their own baptisms in the Jordan River, or perhaps they are themselves baptized in the Jordan River. On St. George's College study pilgrimages, we always go down to the Jordan River, and there we have a brief liturgy of renewal of baptismal vows. Many people choose to go into the water up to their knees, or even fully into the water. It's quite an experience. People come from all over the world, Christians, to remember their baptism, to renew their baptismal vows. And it's one of the places in the country where it's hard to tell what kind of Christian is who, because so many different groups find our common inheritance as Christians in baptism. But there are 2 other reasons that pilgrims come to this very place. Jews visit this place because it is also said to be the traditional place where Joshua led the Hebrew people after the death of Moses across into the promised land toward Jericho. And finally, it's the place where Jewish tradition and later Christian tradition remembers that Elijah ascended up to heaven on his fiery chariot. Scripture tells us that after his baptism in the Jordan, Jesus went into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. But we don't know which wilderness. It's not named. It could have been to the east of the Jordan or to the west in this northern section of the wilderness of Judea, where in fact it has been remembered in the Christian tradition since at least the 3rd century. When Jesus goes into the wilderness, we're told that he spent those days fasting. But it may not mean that he was completely alone. Yes, of course, he had the encounter with the Shatan, the devil. But he may have seen people in that desert, and he certainly may have encountered wild animals. For desert dwellers, today's Bedouin, are numerous in this area and were. And also, Jesus and all travelers would have had to look out for the large and dangerous animals that still inhabited this area. Asiatic lions were still in abundance in Jesus' day in this desert. In the next 6 centuries after Jesus' lifetime, 70 monasteries would be built in the Judean wilderness. Why were people called to go out and live first in little hermit communities called lavras or lauras, or second in a more built-up common community, cenobitic life? Why were they called? They were there for 3 reasons, basically. They were there to imitate Christ in his wilderness experience. They were there to encounter their own demons and to defeat their own spiritual demons. And finally, they had come to exercise dependence on God alone in a fierce landscape. So, we're going to take a look at 2 of the monasteries that sprang up in the 5th century in the Judean wilderness. First is on the walk between Jericho and Jerusalem in a deep ravine called the Wadi Kelt. That's spelled Q-E-L-T. The Wadi Kelt is a steep walk, the ancient Roman road, the road on which Jesus places his parable of the Good Samaritan. That ancient Roman road rose from the lowest place on the face of the earth at about 1,340 feet below sea level to 2,700 feet above sea level at the top of the Mount of Olives. We have a very steep climb, and about a third of the way from Jericho to Jerusalem is St. George Kosiba Monastery. It began with a small community of hermits. The word hermit from the Greek word for desert. So a small group of desert dwellers living in the caves of the limestone cliffs. And then by the early 5th century, coming together in a building, likely more on the weekends, later through the week as well. Coming together for worship, for hot meals on the weekends, and to bring together the fruit of their hand labor, probably things woven out of reed mats. Now, this monastery is inhabited today since the end of the 19th century. It looks like it's hanging on the edge of the cliff. It hasn't been inhabited continuously since the 5th century. It's had its ups and downs, but it is still an important witness to the desert monastic movement and to desert spirituality, even to today. Now, the other monastery I want to mention is not in the Judean wilderness hills, but rather is on the floor of the Jordan River Valley, not far from the place of Jesus' baptism. It was on a main north-south road, and it probably was located there to accommodate traveling pilgrims. Also, it is said to have been built there because it is said Jesus, Mary, and Joseph stopped for Mary to nourish the baby Jesus on the flight into Egypt, escaping the army of Herod the Great. Now, this is a marvelous monastery. It began in a lavra, a small series of caves and a tiny little chapel that can still be visited today. But the new monastery was built in the 5th century, a more community grouping, and several buildings have existed over history. The last one made in the late 19th century, and this is the monastery of Saint Gerasimus. Gerasimus, not well known to us outside of Palestine and Israel, but very well known here as the founder of Palestinian monasticism. Saint Gerasimus is often pictured in icons with a lion. Now, it is said, and perhaps you know this story in other guises, it is said that Gerasimus was approached by a lion who had a thorn in its paw, and the lion allowed the good saint to remove the thorn from his paw and became his faithful companion lifelong. He was a useful lion too, the story goes. One point, he ran after and brought back a donkey that belonged to Gerasimus that had wandered away. So the Good Saints Monastery is still on the desert floor, visited by primarily Orthodox pilgrims, and still in the spirit of desert spirituality and monastic ideals. Of course, Jesus did not know these monasteries in the wilderness. They are things that modern-day pilgrims see when they go out to visit the geography that Jesus knew. So let's backtrack a bit and let's walk with Jesus as we approach Jericho from the north, and we're going to stop for the last night before his final journey to Jerusalem. We're going to stay in Jericho, replenish our food and water, and wake up in the wee hours of the morning with our companions in order to make the 14-mile journey on foot from nearly the lowest place on the face of the earth, up the Wadi Kelt to the Mount of Olives on the east side of Jerusalem. Now, why would pilgrims have wanted to make that journey in one day? Well, it too was a dangerous walk. There were no roadside services. There were no provisions in the middle of the Judean wilderness. People had to carry what they needed. They walked in groups for safety, and they needed to get through that arduous uphill walk in time so that darkness would not fall on them in the wilderness. And as they were walking, if they were going up to the temple in Jerusalem for one of the pilgrimage festivals, chances are they would have been singing and saying one of the Psalms of Ascent, the Psalm section from Psalm 119 to 132 in the scriptures. I will end this pilgrim talk with Psalm 121, one of the more familiar psalms. Perhaps now you will hear it with slightly different ears now that you know the geography that it refers to. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore.